Thank you.
Okay.
It is early morning where I am, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're coming from. I am Rebecca Ames. I'm the Senior Clinical Manager. I'm here with Jim, and I'll turn it right over to you, Jim.
Yes, good day, everyone. We're here in Massachusetts in the middle of a windstorm right now, but otherwise looking forward to talking for a couple of hours here about best practices for student reentry. So just very quickly, we just want to make sure that if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We're going to make sure that you get our slide deck. And if you can keep your cameras on, that's great. If not, we totally understand. But also we always say that when we're talking about a topic like suicide prevention, that we want to make sure that people take care of themselves and take time after the webinar to just do a little bit of self-care here. And just because it's such a challenging topic, we always want to make sure that people are familiar with the 988 and the crisis text line. I know in different places you've got different ways of accessing support 24/7, which Michael just briefed us on a few minutes ago. And just here's what we're going to talk about today. Our focus for this reentry planning meeting is really to talk about students who are returning from a hospital stay due to mental health concerns, more than likely feeling suicidal or having made a suicide attempt. And certainly you have other reasons that students may come back to a reentry meeting. And I think probably you'll find that the template for what we're talking about works today, but there might be some differences. And our focus today is really on the students who are struggling with mental health concerns. We're gonna cover just to make sure that we kind of level up and talk about sort of some basic issues around suicidology. We're going to talk about a trauma-informed approach with a focus on collaborating with parents and why that's so important. And then we'll talk about the concept of a good reentry plan, and we'll follow up at the end with the collaborative safety plan, which is a really effective tool for supporting students when they return. There was a really wonderful article about students talking about their experience of coming back after being in the hospital. And some of the students talked about just how hard it was. They talked about coming back to school with sensory overload. It was hard because of all the people. What were they talking about? I just felt like running away. My friends were like, oh, you were gone for a week. Welcome back. I felt like it had been 3 months. And another student said, I was really lucky because 2 of my teachers were really nice and they were really involved.
Right, I'm going to take it over for a little while. So we're just going to do a teeny bit today of foundation laying, really in the interest of making sure we're kind of on the same page as we launch here, and just reviewing a couple of kind of major foundational concepts in the world of suicide prevention. And the first one is this. This is the definition that we use when we talk about suicide. And I think it's so important because a lot of times we can really, I think kind of the way that we tend to talk about it in society, talk about suicide, is this wish to die. And in fact, we know that's generally not the case for most people struggling with suicidal ideation. It's really this sense of pain, intense pain, often psychological pain, sometimes physical pain, combined with hopelessness. And thinking about suicide, thinking about ending one's life is typically an attempt to solve that problem. The idea that I've tried every way that I can think of to get out of this pain, and what's left, the only thing I can think of, the blinders are on, all that's left in front of me is this idea of just exiting, having an exit plan, right? And so this definition is so important for a couple of reasons. One is it gives us a place to align with this individual, right? Because all of you, the nature of what you do is you help the students solve problems, all kinds of problems. And here's another problem, right? So it takes us away from that panic of, oh my God, you're about to die, hopefully. And we'll touch on that again. and really into the world of problem solving. And it helps us really get, I always say, on the same side of the table as this person, and really align with them in the sense of trying to solve this problem of pain and hopelessness in a way other than taking one's own life. There are so many risk factors for suicide, but we wanted to highlight a handful here that we felt were particularly important in this conversation. One is exposure to suicide. We know that that exposure to suicide is a major risk factor in an individual's own risk for suicide. And part of that is we come back to that attempt to solve the problem idea, right? That if that problem solving strategy has been introduced, that may be a little bit more familiar and a little bit more almost accessible or acceptable to that person. That's particularly true if somebody has a history in their own immediate family. Family tree. Access to means is huge for many reasons. We know that many of the homes of the students that you're working with do have firearms, and we would want to know for any household that that firearm is stored safely. We would particularly want to pay attention in the case where we know somebody is at risk, and really dialing into that and collaborating with the family on safe storage. But we also know, and what I'm going to cover at the end of today, is that the period of time where somebody is immediately in crisis, really in an acute suicidal crisis, is a pretty short window time-wise. And so anything we can do to slow somebody down during that time is an incredibly impactful suicide prevention effort. Even so much as somebody who is agitating around an overdose, if we can collaborate with pharmacies to bubble pack the medication and they have to individually kind of pop every pill out of a package, that can be enough to slow somebody down in the moment. We know in communities where they have erected barriers on bridges that we've seen a decrease in suicides in that community, in those communities. So these are really, really impactful ways to help prevent suicides. We also know that many of your students and many people struggling with suicidal ideation do have comorbid diagnoses. That can be a lot of things. We pay particular attention to anybody's trauma history. We know that trauma is a huge risk factor for suicide. We know over 80% of people who attempt suicide have a trauma history, and I imagine the number's probably higher but underreported. So we always want to be dialed into that. Non-suicidal self-injury, NSSI there on your screen, that's complicated, right? Because by definition, it's non-suicidal, but also it's a risk factor because it's habituation to pain, which is an issue. It's also got a lot of overlapping characteristics with emotion regulation and kind of other aspects of people who are engaging in non-suicidal self-injury where we know it can be a risk factor for suicide. We also want to pay attention to substance use and addiction, which I think have often also overlap with comorbid diagnoses, and also increase impulsivity, decrease access to coping strategies, and a host of other elements there that would increase someone's risk. And then a major thing that we want to emphasize, we do this with everybody, but I think as school professionals, this is probably really potent here, is the ability to work with someone on their cognitive style. So we come back to this definition from the last slide about problem solving, right? That if we see suicide as an attempt to solve a problem, we need to pay attention to what kind of problem solving strategies and what kind of capacity this individual has that we're working with, and then try to really enhance the problem solving bandwidth, right? So we know that perfectionism is a huge risk factor for suicide. We know that this idea of this all or nothing thinking, right? Either I get an A on this test or my life is over is a major risk. We don't want that to be the stakes, right? So anything we can do to help somebody with all or nothing thinking, which perfectionism is a type of, anybody who has trouble with sort of distress tolerance, seeing shades of gray, managing that middle ground, those are great points of entry for making a difference with a student. And Jim, feel free to jump in if there's anything you want to add. I do want to take a moment to touch on cultural theory. We could spend a whole day talking about it, and I'm going to do this very quickly with very large concepts. But we do know that you guys are working around the globe, right? You're going to be working with families of many kinds of cultures, and we always want to be mindful of the role that plays. When we're thinking about the expression of suicidal ideation, the permissibility of suicidal ideation and the expression of that, and even so far as what kind of methods an individual might be considering. So one of the concepts here is called cultural sanctions. It comes from Joyce Chu's work. She really talks about whether suicide at all is considered acceptable, whether there might be an honor suicide or it's something that's totally swept under the rug. Is this something that is even on the table to talk about to begin with? And then how would that ideation be expressed? That's going to vary within cultures. Am I likely to talk about it at all? If I do talk about it, how would that be expressed? And then again, culture actually has implications on what means somebody might be considering in taking their own life. So here in the US, we have a lot of firearm suicides. In other parts of the world, they have pesticide suicides. And so it really does have implications there as well. And the last part of this enormous theory that I'll touch on very quickly is minority stress. And the fact that often somebody who is experiencing stress related to their identity, whether that's their racial identity, their sexual orientation identity, typically if they're experiencing stress, they're experiencing that in a number of areas in their life. And that can really compound and stack on top of itself and become really a cumulative experience. And we want to think about, does that stress include experiences with the healthcare system and the mental health care system, right? And is there reluctance to even engage with those supports? On the flip side of all these risk factors, and again, I'm kind of fire hosing you with massive concepts here, but we have protective factors. And a protective factor is really anything that helps mitigate risk. Now we know that there are a lot of them that have been shown to be particularly impactful. And one of those that we highlight in all our trainings, and is so appropriate today, is a safe and supportive school environment. This can be such a powerful, powerful place for youth to feel safe, to feel supported, to feel at ease, to feel that they can authentically show up as themselves, and that the work you do every day engaging with these students is truly making a difference. And another really big one that I think very much applies to the work you do is connection. Am I connected to my school community? Do I have peers? Do I have trusted adults here? Those are really impactful ways that we can mitigate an individual's risk. Conceptually, to just pull a lot of this together, one of the major themes that we emphasize in our trainings is that suicide is a complex, multifactorial event. And what we mean by that is we often kind of boil suicide down to a single cause when we talk about it, because it's just a really overwhelming concept. The fact that somebody could be thinking about ending their life, or have attempted to end their life, or have died by suicide, we have a hard time kind of wrapping our brains around that, and we tend to oversimplify it. And this is actually damaging in the world of suicide prevention. Am I still online? Because my power just flickered. Am I? Oh.
Yes, you're still online. You're still there.
I'm going to be done with my part in a second anyway. And so we just want to be mindful of kind of thinking about this as a comprehensive event. There's a lot that goes into this, and this is really important in how we deliver that information to the youth that we're working with, right? And so we have kind of something already going on in the background. I sort of think of it as just this, something that may be just increasing somebody's vulnerability, right? A mood disorder, a family history, low serotonin. I want to mention that identifying as LGBTQ+ in and of itself does not need necessarily increase somebody's risk, but the sense of being safe in doing so? Am I accepted in my family, in my school, in my community? Can I be authentically who I am on the inside, on the outside? That does have very much so implications on somebody's risk. So something may be going on in the background. And then there's this stressful event, which is generally what we kind of boil that down to, right? Oh, they had, a breakup and they killed themselves. They were bullied and they killed themselves. And it's not the cause, but it may be that event that kind of sends somebody into this state of a huge shift in affect. So this is where we see somebody's no longer anxious, they're panicked. They're not just angry, they're rageful. There's this really big shift in somebody's emotional state. And then from there, perhaps there's, they have a great collaborative suicide safety plan we'll go over today. They are, comfortable calling 988. They have a lot of supports around them. They're not isolated. The lethal means are stored safely. There's anything that sort of inhibits that becoming a suicide death or the absence of those. And so again, really big concepts really quickly, but this is so important because we always want to remember how much goes into somebody reaching a place where they attempt or take their own life, and that there's a whole world in which we can also intervene, make a difference, right? Show up, work with somebody on their coping strategies, and that we always want to talk about suicide as this perfect storm, as this complex multifactorial event, rather than oversimplifying it, for the sake of protecting our whole community, so that people understand this is a really complicated event. This is a really complicated mental space, there's so much there that we can dive into when we're working with individuals on in a prevention model, which is less the focus of today, but we wanted to set the stage. Just a couple last points here from me. We know that it is safe and recommended to ask somebody directly, are you thinking of suicide? We also know that you may not get an honest answer, and we need to be realistic about that, right? Because we know that once somebody says yes, they lose complete control of where this conversation goes. Can you handle that conversation? Can you meet them where they are? Can you engage in collaborative problem solving? Or are you about to panic? Are you about to call 911 or whatever the equivalent would be in your part of the world, right? Are you judging them? Are they disappointing you in saying yes? And then we'll talk today about suicide being dynamic. And maybe the answer is no, because right now it's not on their mind, but this morning it was. Right. So we want to be realistic. We know there's lots of reasons somebody might say no. It's a reason to probably ask again. And we also want to remember how high the stakes are if somebody is honest and says yes. Lastly here, I want to note that the topic of suicide causes big feelings in all of us. Right? If you're sitting with a student and they're talking about their own suicidality, it's very likely that you are having a huge internal experience. Your heart rate is probably accelerated. Your mind is probably racing through all the things you need to do and ask and say, and the forms you might need to fill out, and what's going to happen, and the panic, right? And what we really want to push for, really, really deeply want to push for and encourage you to think about, is how to slow that down. How to manage that anxiety so that you can continue to show up, lean in, say to somebody, I hear you're in pain, I hear your hopelessness. How can I help? Right? We know that for schools, there's often this better safe than sorry mentality. There's a lot of liability anxiety, there's protocols, and that schools often default to a better safe than sorry and sort of send someone off to a hospital. We know that that often makes things worse for an individual for a host of reasons, right? You may have somebody with a trauma history. Going to the hospital can be very traumatizing, re-traumatizing. And we really want to encourage you to, as much as possible, keep students safe and supported in their school environment. There will be times that you may need to call for a hospital, right? When somebody is acutely unsafe. But we do want to encourage you to manage that internal experience, manage that anxiety, And remember that often the school is the most safe and supportive environment for that individual. And that's a huge protective factor for them, right? It's just a couple slides ago. And the more we can help students stay safe in the community, we really stand a chance of making a huge difference. So that's our little pitch on that. I'm going to turn this over to Jim.
Oops. Hang on a minute here while I try to pull up my slides. You see that okay?
Yes, yes.
So here at the Riverside Trauma Center, we see everything through that trauma lens, and certainly a lot of our work over the last few years has really been about that intersection between trauma and suicide. It's such a major risk factor for people. And so we really want to keep a focus on that as we we move through thinking about reentry planning and safety planning, and just what it's like for kids coming back from from the hospital. So you have a student, they've been in the hospital, or they've been out maybe in a respite program. They're coming back to school now, and the impact of hospitalization is major. And we really want to assume that it's that it's been a traumatic experience for most students. And these students are coming back to you, and they're at extremely high risk. I mean, there have been different studies. I mean, there was one study for adolescents that post-discharge, within that 3 to 5 day period, that they were 100 times more likely to make a suicide attempt during that 3 to 5 days post-discharge. So we want to make sure that when kids are coming back from the hospital, that we don't assume that everything is okay and that they're ready to sort of start jumping in and learning again right away. It definitely is a high risk period. So for this reason, we want the reentry plan to make sure that we are recognizing all the signs and symptoms of trauma in a student's behavior. Oftentimes that student who appears to be, disinterested or fatigued, or maybe even wreaking havoc with their behaviors, we want to make sure that we are considering whether or not that behavior is a focus of is because of their traumatic experience and their trauma history. And again, one of the key points about any trauma-informed approach to learning or to kids coming back to school is we want to make sure that we're avoiding re-traumatization. So, and that's key. I mean, I think it's so easy for kids coming back to end up being re-triggered. So Rebecca talked about schools. You create an emotionally and physically safe environment for students. And I think that sometimes when students are coming back from the hospital, you may have to sort of tweak some of those things that you do to keep the environment safe. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about those. And then also recognizing the healing power of relationships, I think, is so important when we're talking about a trauma-informed approach. And for kids, they often describe the experience of having one caring adult who makes all the difference for them when they're coming back from a hospital situation. And when we're talking about traumatized kids, we should just assume that we're talking about traumatized parents as well. So Rebecca talked about this really major significant number here, that 80% of suicide attempters have a trauma history. Well, if that's the case, I think we should assume that 100% of their parents also have a trauma history. And you may have experience with these parents before the student was hospitalized or over the years that they've been in your school. And maybe there's some conflicting relationships. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And just assume that some part of the hospitalization process was potentially traumatic for students and their parents. Oftentimes students, I know at our agency for years and years, it was required that if we sent a student to the hospital, that they had to go in an ambulance, that they were strapped down on a gurney, they would get to the hospital emergency room, they would have their clothes taken from them. And over the course of a couple of hours, they would get interviewed by 4, 5, 6 different people. And all of those things can be really traumatic for kids and re-triggering of their own trauma history. So we want to make sure that we're considering that when kids come back into the building, that they may very well have had a potentially traumatic experience. And certainly for older kids who were involuntarily hospitalized, it is the odds are very likely that for them the experience was not helpful. We're currently doing a study right now, and about 64% of people who were in the hospital described the experience as not helpful. So we want to make sure that we consider that hospitalization is not always the answer. And again, just sort of looking through the trauma lens, trauma engenders helplessness. We want to find ways to think about how we can empower students, giving them choices, asking them, who's your trusted adult in school and out of school? If I have to call one of your parents, which parent should I call? Are there any other relationships in your life with adults that are positive? Any staff here at the school? And sometimes kids will say, well, I really like my counselor, but she's got 200 kids or 250 kids on her caseload. And I don't want to be a burden to her. And so they look for other adults in the building who they feel like get them. For example, you'll hear students say, well, my trusted adult is Mrs. Brown, my math teacher. I feel like she really gets me. I feel like she wouldn't overreact. So we want to make sure that that we're taking those different adults into consideration and following the student's inclination for who's going to be the best support for them. And then everything that we talk about in our trauma-informed approach is about collaboration. We want to make sure that students have a voice. That's really essential. So when we're creating safety plans or reentry plans, it's not the school's plan, it's not the student's plan, it's the joint plan between students, parents, and school. And also, again, because these parents very well may be traumatized themselves, I think we want to find ways to try to empower parents, and just even saying statements to parents like, you know your child better than anyone. What are your ideas for how we can help them? What are the resources that you use that have been helpful to you over the years? And so we really want to have this separate module just on engaging parents because we feel like that's such a key to a good reentry plan. And the issue here is that parents are oftentimes the last to know that their child has been thinking about suicide. In a 2019 survey, 50% of parents didn't know their child had thoughts of suicide. And so now they've come out of the hospital and they're back in school, and the parents may still be struggling with what happened that led their child to being in the hospital. So we just want to make sure that we're thinking about that context, that these parents may still be very overwhelmed by this experience of having their child be in the hospital. And you may find that they're not quite where you would like them to be when it comes time to talk about a reentry plan. And parents may have had a conflicting relationship with the school to begin with, and they very likely may have had a difficult relationship during their own school years as well, struggling in school. And so that carries over to their child and how they meet you halfway. So, but parents, there was one study that, or fairly recent study that showed that about 78% of parents do think that schools should be teaching their kids about suicide prevention. And yet you sort of see the the dilemma here that about 50% of parents whose child was suicidal and maybe even in the hospital, they did not tell the school. And they are thinking, well, I don't, if the school knows there's going to be too much added stress on my child, they may not necessarily see the school as being a supportive environment early on. And a lot of times, what we see with older kids, with high school kids, is their parents say, well, I don't want the school to know because then they won't write a good, counselors won't write a good recommendation for my child to go to college. And of course, we know that that's not the least bit accurate, but that's their perception. And so it's a good place for us to sort of start that conversation with parents. And parents can be, they're going to have strong feelings. They may still be scared, hopeless, feeling like things are completely out of control. They might feel like their child was getting something from the hospital and now they're being discharged prematurely. They're not ready to come home. So parents may be struggling with that. There may be, oftentimes there's conflict between the two parents or two caregivers. One parent may think that this is a non-issue. This is not a mental health issue. This is a behavioral issue, and we have to increase our discipline. And the other parent may feel like, no, we've got to approach this from the mental health lens. And so sometimes those parents are in conflict, and when they come to the reentry meeting, you're gonna see this conflict get manifested. They may not know how to find treatment in their community, or there may be long waiting lists. They may be worried about how they're going to pay for it, and that concern really can look like all of these different ways that parents are feeling could really look like they're being resistant. We always want to try to reframe that resistance as fear or ambivalence. So one of the things that we want you to do is to just practice extreme empathy. So, sometimes you may be thinking, this parents, they're being so resistant. They're not returning my phone calls. They are not cooperating with a reentry plan. And that just looks like that resistance that we're talking about. But for the parent, they may be feeling like, I'm the worst parent in the world. Everybody knew my child was suicidal, but me, I'm so humiliated. And then they, have this conversation with you that feels like resistance. So how do we support families? Well, again, that extreme empathy, practicing that extreme empathy, listening well, giving them an opportunity to have their say, not rushing into that conversation. Psychoeducation, probably one of the most important interventions that we have for anyone that has a traumatic experience is that psychoeducation, letting them know sort of a lot of what's happening to them are really common reactions. Remembering, of course, that they have parents, these very likely have their own trauma history. Rebecca talked about the need for always making sure that we have a conversation about keeping the environment safe and thinking about all the other additional resources that are available to them. And just, trying to be that supportive person for that family, just sort of checking in. I mean, this has been a really hard phone call, and I know, there's still so many things going on for you, and it still feels so overwhelming. How about if I give you a call tomorrow and just check in with you, or can I make some calls for you? I know you're worried about finding resources. Can I make some calls for you? Or, you talked about, you talked about your sister or your brother being really helpful to you. How about if you ask them to come over and be a support for you? And oftentimes we might want to try to normalize the experience that they have, talking about how this has been such a scary experience for them. And, there's been so much information out there about kids struggling during the pandemic. So normalizing that for parents can also be very helpful. And just certainly so much in the media these days about social media, just the impact on kids. And so we want to make sure that we're acknowledging that there's a lot of things going on in the world, in your community. Things are harder now because graduation is approaching and everyone's anxiety is high. So, normalizing that experience, letting parents know that other kids are struggling, and that we're going to be able to get through this, right? I mean, that's one of the things that you saw our definition of what a suicide attempt is, that it's that struggle of pain and hopelessness, that combination of pain and hopelessness. So anything that we can do to provide hope for parents is going to be a powerful intervention. So let's talk a little bit specifically about reentry. Here's another student's comment about their experience with reentry. There was not much communication or help. They always tell you in high school, you're on your own and stuff, but you can at least try to help me. Come on, I've been gone for a week and a half. Can't you just please make this easier for me? Especially when coming back from a place like that and you have to readjust yourself to being back into normal life and stuff. It's like you're just throwing this all at me and expecting me to be at focus. Yeah, I just wasn't ready for that. So you hear this student's voice talking about just being so overwhelmed and not being ready to come back to school, not feeling ready to come back to school. So what is a reentry plan? I mean, what are we talking about? Let's provide a definition here. And I think the simplest explanation of a reentry plan is it's just a roadmap to help students successfully transition back to school after hospitalization. A reentry plan should always involve the student, the parents, and key school staff. And when I talk about students, I know that schools that we've worked with before, they have routinely had students as young as 8, 9 years old be part of that reentry plan. Now, if a student is younger, you're going to have to do more preparation for that meeting. But having those kids in the reentry meeting is really going to be key. We talk about the components of a good reentry plan. Number one, you want to have a reentry meeting ahead of time before the student comes back to school. You want to make sure that you have good communication plan in place. You want to make sure that you have academic support in place. That's going to be what feels most overwhelming to students in most cases. And then you want to make sure that you're also providing good social emotional support. I think these 4 components of a good reentry plan are really key to the successful reentry plan and students being able to catch back up. So the primary task that we're thinking about when we're talking about a reentry plan, number one, hold that meeting before the students return, not on the day that they're coming back to school. Ideally, maybe the day before, a couple days before, so that everybody has a chance to sort of process that. Ideally, if the meeting is at school, but before the student comes back into classrooms, that's going to be really helpful, and that's going to be a small step too in terms of desensitization of having the student and their parents come back into the building. And then we're going to talk about just the need to make sure that we have a good collaborative safety plan in place. They very likely, the students may have come out of the hospital with a safety plan. And we always say, and Rebecca will talk about this, we always say the safety plan is a living document. We're going to make a lot of changes to it as the students' needs change over the course of days, weeks, and months. And then planning with teachers, for that incremental return. How are they going to catch up on school work? Is that even remotely possible if they've been gone for a long time? How do we do that? And that may, to the student, feel like the number one stressor in their life. And then talking with the student about what are they going to say? What are they going to do when they come back to school? How are they going to manage this? So you have a student who's been out of school for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, they come back and kids are asking them, where have you been? Why weren't you at school? You've got teachers asking, where have you been? So what are you going to say? Are you going to tell people that you've been out of school? So you need to do some rehearsal and think about the language that you're going to use in telling people where you've been. What's your story? What are you willing to share with other students, with faculty as well? So one of the core elements that we talked about for a reentry plan is really just that collaboration and communication. So who's at the table? We want the parents and the students to be there. But what about school staff? What are the students' needs and limitations when they come back? And I think if you have the opportunity to let students tell you what that hospital experience was like, did they learn anything about themselves? That's going to be key as well. Did they find it helpful, or if they found it not helpful at all, found maybe even traumatizing? You want to know that as well. Were there specific recommendations from the hospital? Do you have did you have the ability, did parents sign a release? Are they willing to sign a release so that you can talk with the hospital about that discharge plan? And then at that very first meeting, you want to make sure that you plan for follow-up meetings as well. And I think a key point, which I alluded to here, is really just having this open communication, letting the student, talk about their experience, share their feelings. What are they afraid of? What are they most worried about? What are their major concerns? And again, just as you know from those of you that have been doing the SOS Signs of Suicide program, this idea of trusted adults is so important to kids, even beginning at a very early age. Who are the adults in school? Who are the adults outside of school that they trust and can go to if they're struggling? Something really terrible happens to you, you're scared, you're not sure, what to do. Who is that adult that you can go to who's going to help you get through this? And so that trusted adult really becomes important. And again, we want somebody, we want a trusted adult in the school building, but we also want a trusted adult outside of school. So for evenings, weekends, school breaks, we want to make sure that they have that trusted adult as well. The second component is academic support. How much work has the student missed, and are they in a place now where they can learn? Do we have a plan for catching up? Is that even feasible? Does it make sense? Can we modify things? Can we be more flexible? What kind of support do they need? Are they going to need some one-on-one academic support? And again, we want to involve the teachers, but we want to also be careful that we're not overwhelming teachers with a lot of additional work for students coming back. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And when we're talking about academics, so this student who has been in the hospital, now they may be on a new medication that's contributing to them feeling like they're kind of out of it, that they really are fatigued, they're struggling, they don't feel like they can learn, they just sort of feel cognitively offline. And that fatigue is something that's going to be very common because it really is a major factor when we're talking about trauma and recovering from a traumatic experience. And, oftentimes that fatigue, it can really look like a student is disinterested. It can look like they really they don't care about catching up. Or you just sort of feel like they're not really fully participating in the reentry plan. But if we recognize that fatigue could really be a sign of trauma and a sign that they're really still struggling, and that they're unable and not unwilling. That next core element is social and emotional well-being. Can you build in peer support? Are there friends that your student can say, no, I really want to, if I can hang out with, with my friends, if you can sort of fill them in on what happened, ask these students to sort of reach out and be available to the student who's coming back into the building for the first time in a couple of weeks, or maybe even longer. Can you sit down with these friends and sort of talk about how they can be supportive to their friend coming back in, what to say, what not to say? I think all of these things are really key. I mean, I think there have been cases where students have been out for quite a long time, and a school counselor has even built a group around the student with their friends and just sort of talking what it's like, that culture of belonging that's so important. And you heard Rebecca talk about the importance of social connections. Probably the number one protective factor that we have against suicide is that our social connections. We want to make sure that they're getting the mental health support that they need. What are you able to provide in school? What kind of support needs to be out there after school hours, out in the community? We want to make sure that we're not, oftentimes students feel like they're just being left on their own. And is there a way when that student needs that support, even if it's in the middle of a, math class or anything, is there a way for them to sort of give you a signal that they're struggling, they need to leave the classroom and go and find that identified support person in the building? Those are some of the things that we want to make sure that we're taking into consideration. And then when we're talking about these sort of potential setbacks, a lot of times students will describe a time of day in a place in your building that is really where they really struggle. They really feel dysregulated. Some kids will say, I just can't stand the crowds in the hallway. It just feels completely overwhelming. I feel like when I'm walking down the hallway and there's 100 kids walking down the same hallway, I feel like I'm going to have a panic attack. Is there something that we can do? Can we let the students have maybe our plan is to let the student leave class 5 minutes early so they can get to their next class without having to deal with all of those other students who are in the hallway and their lockers and that kind of thing. Do they have a hard time at cafeteria? Is there a plan for who they can sit with at lunch? And we hear a lot of kids, as you know better than I, a lot of kids who really struggle after school with riding the bus, or what that's like, what the bus ride is like, and what kind of activities are happening on the bus. How overwhelming is it for them to be on the bus? So let's identify all of those places where they might be struggling. For a lot of kids, it might be the gym class. So identifying all those potential setbacks is really going to be key. And then the other thing too is just, what about unstructured time? You know, are there study breaks that 15 minutes, 30 minutes before school starts? What are the things that we can do to make sure that we're taking care of that unstructured time? Because, you know, we want students to be in a structured environment. I mean, I think we all say that we don't always love structure, but the truth is that structure always reduces our anxiety. When we know where we're supposed to be, when we're supposed to be there, what we're supposed to do when we're there, it reduces our anxiety considerably for all of us. And so anything that we can do to reinforce routines and provide that calm and environment is going to be key. And then the fourth element is really about physical health and accommodations. Do we have medical clearance? You know, are there issues, that other medical issues that arose during hospitalization, in addition to the psychiatric issues that arose during hospitalization? You know, do we have, is the student coming back with a new medication, and we don't quite know, you know, this is only the third day or the fifth day that they've been on this new medication. So what are we supposed to watch for? We need that information from their medical team. So, you know, early on, getting parents to sign that release, and talking with them about why, you know, we need that information. You know, we want to think about any physical limitations. You know, if this student is struggling with sexual identity, sexual gender issues, you know, how are we supporting them around access to bathrooms, for example? So these are some of the key features. And of course, we want to make sure that if you have a nurse in your school full-time or part-time, that they are part of this reentry conversation. Making sure that medical clearance is there is really paramount. Having frequent conversations with between the nurse and the parents about the medication and how it's going, talking with the students about side effects, giving them that opportunity to do that. So oftentimes when there's medication involved, the school nurse is going to be one of the key people in our reentry plan. So there's some additional considerations that we want to consider. You know, who's our point person? Who's the best person in the building to coordinate with the student, with the family, with any kind of therapeutic team involved in school or out of school? Who's the best person to sort of bring school staff up to date? Those teachers need updates about how things are going, what they may need to do to modify a student's schedule or their workload. I think that's going to be one of the major issues that this point person is going to have to deal with. So ideally, having somebody who knows the student, has a good connection with the family, and can keep everybody up to date is going to be key. And schools, one of the values of schools is that they value information. And so, you know, who really needs to know, are there people, we don't want to overwhelm the student with every faculty member, every staff member knowing what's going on with them. But who are the people that do need to know and be kept up to date? And I think a lot of times, some schools may err on the side of not giving any information whatsoever to school staff. But again, if you've had that conversation with parents, they know that it's really important for their child's teachers to know what's going on, because it really is going to make that transition so much easier. That's going to be a really helpful conversation for people. And then again, who's going to monitor the plan? That's going to be a key feature here as well. And then how are we going to acknowledge progress that's being made when things are going well? Certainly when things aren't going well, we're going to know about that. But what about when things are going well and the reentry plan is working, the student is succeeding, they're starting to catch up, they're starting to feel more connected back to their classmates and to the school in general. They sort of feel like they're rebuilding those social connections. How are we gonna celebrate that progress? So we want to make sure that we have a place for acknowledging success. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but just the demands on teaching staff. Teachers are likely feeling overwhelmed at many points during the school year. And so if we're asking a teacher to make, excessive modifications to a student's learning plan, we want to make sure that we are sensitive to that teacher as well, and that we're not putting on them just unreasonable expectations for helping a student with that in terms of academic support. So I think a key feature of any reentry planning is really building on a safety plan. And we're going to talk about, Rebecca's going to sort of talk about this next. But like I said, it's very likely that that the student is coming back from the hospital with a safety plan. So we want to build on that. We want to modify it as needed. And Rebecca's going to talk about a collaborative safety planning, which is one that we usually find very helpful for students. Stop sharing. Are you?
I kicked you out.
Okay.
Just gonna set my computer up again. All right, so I don't know if any of you have come across this before. We'll be covering the Stanley Brown Collaborative Safety Plan. And I mentioned this earlier, but I think we often tend to think about a student, an individual struggling with suicidal ideation as a blanket statement, as a state of being, right? As this kind of trait of feeling suicidal. And what we know is that suicidal ideation and suicidal risk are incredibly dynamic and often very rapid. Somebody can be acutely suicidal in the morning, not thinking of it all, a couple of hours later, back to feeling suicidal by the afternoon, maybe in the middle of the night when they wake up, but it really does fluctuate. It's also true, right? We talked about all the reasons that somebody might not disclose suicidal ideation. We know that that's common, right? We know that people either deny it or just don't bring it up. And then the loved ones are sort of left with these pieces of all these questions, right? After there's been a loss. And so the point here is we need to be comfortable asking, and we need to ask and have these conversations with some regularity, right? Because we may catch them at a different moment in time and have a very different conversation. A little bit of a visual here, right? Because we talked about that flow chart that I mentioned earlier about the fact that somebody may have kind of a lot going on in the background. Somebody may come kind of in and out of a suicidal state. And so in there may be kind of any number of things going on, and then that event happens. Or something, they have a limited access to their protective factors, and there's a really big spike, right? We talked about that big emotional shift and that suicidal crisis, that window where that red arrow is, where somebody we consider acutely suicidal, ready to engage in suicidal behaviors, that can be as little as 5 to 20 minutes. So again, when we're trying to think about keeping somebody safe in the bigger picture, here we're going to really hone in on keeping somebody safe in a 5 to 20 minute window until those feelings can begin to dissipate. We know that over 90% of people who survive a suicide attempt do not go on to die by suicide. If we can keep people safe in this window, we have a really good chance of keeping them safe in the bigger picture as well. Now, on the other side of that, they survive an attempt or they don't attempt, there may be ambivalence, there may be relief, there may be regret, there may be all of these at the same time, right? Because we're human and we can experience complex emotions. But we've managed to stay safe in that window. And so this tool that we're going to talk about today, this was actually developed initially, intended to be a tool for cognitive behavioral therapy with adolescents. And Stanley and Brown discovered it was actually an incredibly powerful tool entirely on its own. If we think about what we know about protecting an individual in a suicidal crisis, we talked about making sure they don't have access to lethal means or they're going to be slowed down in any number of ways to save a life. We want to decrease isolation, connect them. Jim talked a lot about connection. Decreasing agitation, any work you do on emotion regulation plays right in here. Structure, Jim talked about structure being really calming, right? If somebody's having an internal experience, feeling very out of control, we want to provide any kind of structure we can. It's incredibly calming, incredibly powerful. Hope. Somebody is struggling with hopelessness, we'll say, I'm going to hold the hope. I know you can't, you're not there right now. We talk about authentic hope. Things are tough right now. We're not belittling that. I'm just going to stay with you through this time. I'm going to be here. We're going to solve this problem together. I'm in it with you, right? Reality testing. The blinders are on. They've lost sight of the fact that there are other ways out of this problem. And we want to develop a suicide safety plan, which is what I'm going to get into now. So it is a brief, easy to read document. It is a single page with just a bunch of questions and a bunch of lines. It's super straightforward. It's hierarchically arranged. This is important because a really big theme that I'm about to talk to you about is the fact that when somebody is in a suicidal crisis, they are going to lose access to executive functioning, right? That higher level thinking, that's offline. We're in primal brain mode. And so we want to take any need for thought or decision making out of it. We're going to say, here's step 1. That doesn't work. Here's step 2. That doesn't work. Here's step 3, making it really simple and straightforward. It's written in the student's own words. Something I really love about the suicide safety plan is that I think about how often as clinicians, and especially if we think about working with minors, how often are we telling them what's good for them? How often are we kind of preaching at someone, right? And this is a chance to say, you tell me what works for you. What are the things that help you here? It's developed collaboratively. We're going to maybe guide the conversation, assist the conversation. Maybe it's in their words, but we're doing the writing. So there's a bit of a transitional object. There's some research supporting that. There's an app. It can be done on a phone. I recommend paper and pencil. I can talk about that in a minute. But the idea here of really empowering this individual to be the expert on their own life, on their own coping strategies, and to then use that to inform their own safety plan. So this is probably hard to read on your screen. That's fine. I just want you to have a visual for just how simple and straightforward the safety plan is. This is the whole thing right here. I'm going to go through it step by step so you don't have to worry about being able to read tiny writing on your screen. We start by zooming out, right? One of my favorite maxims that I stole from Jim actually is strike while the iron is cold. I mentioned we don't want to try to be doing any problem solving when the executive functioning is offline. We want to do the thinking about this in a moment of calm. I want to be able to say to that person, what does it look like, feel like, sound like for you inside your body, inside your mind when you start to spiral? What would I notice if I were sitting in the room? What would I notice start to shift with you? How do we know it's time to use the safety plan? We're gonna write that right down, right there on the top part. There may be automatic thoughts. There may be flashbacks, trauma history. It may be an incredible shift of mood, the urge to use drugs, right? Uncontrollable crying. What are the things? How are we going to know it's time to pull out the safety plan? And then this is, again, really important and really powerful. We're going to start with an internal locus of control and move out from there. So what are the things that you can do for yourself? We think a lot, we haven't talked about this today because it's really trying to focus this training on the reentry, right? But we know that a major issue in suicidal ideation is a sense of burdensomeness, that somebody often feels they are a burden on others. And one of the ways that that might manifest is the fear of talking about this with other people, of putting it on you, of putting it on other loved ones. Also, if the suicidal crisis is happening at 2 o'clock in the morning, it may be a lot harder to utilize those resources. And again, we're talking about this 5 to 20-minute window. What can you do for yourself? Distraction is a very powerful tool here. We're just trying to make it through this window. We're not trying to solve all life's problems. We're just trying to keep you safe right now. What are things you can do by yourself, for yourself? Now, we want this to be very practical and very utilitarian. So we always want to double back and think about specificity and practicality. Again, reminder, we're thinking about somebody we want to take all the decision-making right out of this. So if they tell me I'm going to go on a walk, great. I want to know, where are you going on a walk? Because in a moment of crisis, I don't want deciding where to walk to be the reason that you kind of throw the whole thing out the window and don't engage with the safety plan. Where are you going to walk to? Specificity. Practicality. I'm talking to you right now while there is an insane storm happening outside my window. I'm expecting like Auntie M to go by at any moment. So if it was a day like this, what is something you could do? The weather's not cooperating. What is something you could do? Now, most people and 100% of adolescents are going to tell you they're going to listen to music, right? So specificity. Do you have a playlist? Can we title the playlist Safety Plan Playlist? Or angry playlist, sad playlist, right? Practicality is, well, if your suicidal crisis happens at 2 o'clock in the morning and you like to listen to the music that's really loud with a ton of bass because it just kind of takes over your body and you can numb everything else out, do you have earbuds? Are they charged and are they on your nightstand? Right? So we're looking at this from the sense of, I'm not just telling you what's good for you. I want you to tell me what's good for you, and I want to make sure this is usable. If there's any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute. So that's the internal locus of control. Then we think about, who are people, where are places you can go that would provide that distraction? Why are we not jumping right into who's your trusted adult? Who are the people that really know and get you? We come back to that burdensomeness. A lot of times there's some hesitation around taking it there because those are the people that may also drop in more easily to panic mode. So is there a club you're part of? Could you reach out to somebody who's in that club and have some sort of social engagement there? If video games are safe and not triggering for an individual, this could be a time that they engage in some video games. We used to talk about mall walking. That feels very dated at this point, but the idea of being anywhere public, is there a basketball court down the street? Could you just go and watch some people shoot hoops and just be around people for a little bit? And then again, we want as much specificity and as much practicality. So I'd want to know from a practicality standpoint that we have something for daytime. And if we know that there's suicidal crises come in the night, I'd want to know we had something that you could do, maybe calling 988, although that comes in later, being in an online forum, for example, that might come at a different time of day, just to make sure this is really utilitarian. From there, we kind of go to your people, right? These are the people that they're your trusted adults. They're good friends, although if you're working with minors, we really want the people in, friends would kind of be more step 3, and step 4 would be trusted adults. They may have like older siblings or somebody that you feel makes sense here. But these are the people that when you call and you say, I'm calling because I'm using my safety plan, they know what's going on. right? They know to stay on the phone with you or get over to the house. And this is another point here. First name, last name, phone number. Especially when we think about step 3, when there may be people that are just more socially in your realm. I know there are a ridiculous number of people named Jen in my cell phone address book. And if I told you I was going to call Jen, I might know in the moment who I meant. And then when I go to use my safety plan, I have no idea which Jen that was. So maybe it's first name, last name, and a parenthetical, right, from Chess Club or something, and a phone number right there, listed out, written out, no decision-making required in the moment. Same thing here. Then we look back at it. Okay, anything going on here? I see you listed your mom. Great. Also, I know sometimes you and your mom kind of butt heads a lot. Can we make sure there's somebody on this list that if you're going through a phase where you and your mom are having a tougher time, that person, maybe it's your best friend's mom, might be a really good person, kind of one level removed, who can be your trusted adult here. So we really want this to be utilitarian, practical, usable. Step 5, now here's where we're at the professionals, right? An outpatient therapist, the 988 hotline, any other clinicians they're involved with, urgent care services. Some of this is going to depend on where in the world you guys are tuning in from and what the resources are contextual to where you live. But this is distracting myself didn't work. Calling somebody socially didn't work, or watching people shoot hoops down the street didn't work. Called my mom, I'm still just really feeling acutely unsafe. These are the people, right? This is maybe the local emergency services number. How are we going to keep you safe right now? Then, so we started by zooming out and saying, how are we going to know it's time to use your safety plan? We did the safety plan. Then we end by zooming out again. I want to think, if all else fails, if you've gone through all these steps, you've engaged in all these attempts to keep yourself safe, and you're still feeling acutely suicidal, I want to know that your environment is keeping you safe for us, for you, right? And it's doing the work. So is there a firearm in the home? Is it stored safely? If you're IVing around medication, can it be in a lockbox and somebody else has the key or bubble wrapped, right? What can we do so that your environment is helping support your safety? And then we always ask about a reason for living. If you go to the Stanley Brown website and you do any education that's additional today, which I hope you're excited to do, on the collaborative suicide safety plan, you won't see this question on there. We always include it. And here's what I get from people, right? What if they say no? This is anxiety about asking, because what if they don't have an answer? Am I making it worse? For me, there's the question of, well, what if they had a great answer and you didn't ask the question? I think there's a lot to be risked there. And I think that's about our skills demonstrating as trusted adults for this individual, we can have tough conversations. Wow, you can't think of a reason for living right now. That feels really worrisome. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Maybe we can both agree to brainstorm a little bit about this and just think if by the next time I see you, either one of us can come up with any ideas. I feel really worried about you, right? The ability to have that tough conversation is an intervention in and of itself. The other thing is, can we make this shorter term, right? It doesn't have to be a reason for living for the rest of my life, but you have a cat. I like snuggling my cat. I want to see my cat when I get home today. Or my niece's first birthday party is this weekend. I want to make it to this weekend to be at her first birthday party. This does not need to be a really broad, overwhelming, long-term goal. It's just something immediate that if we've gotten to the end of the safety plan, this is something that's just going to keep me here till tomorrow, and tomorrow, and then tomorrow. Hopefully that resonated. Jim mentioned this should be a living, breathing document. This is not a one and done, right? Because we're always coming back to the idea of this being utilitarian. So we finish, we spend this time, we fill out the safety plan. All right, I'm curious, let's look back over this. How likely are you to use this? there anything we didn't think of that should be on here? Are there things that are on here that now that you're looking at them, you're probably really not ever going to call your best friend's mom? So maybe that was just to make me feel better. Can we come up with somebody else on here, right? Who needs to have a copy of this? The people on step 4, can we let them know they're the people on step 4? Hey, if so-and-so calls and says, I'm calling because I'm using my safety plan, they know what that means. This is why I like for it to be pencil and paper. I think there's a lot about writing that's really helpful, but also it makes it easier to kind of photocopy and put in places. We've heard a lot of people like to have it on their bathroom mirror. Maybe it's inside their locker, in the back of a notebook, on their desk. But it's easier to then give a copy to mom, give a copy to a therapist, give a copy to other agencies that are involved with this child. And then we want this to be something that we're revisiting. So, hey, I haven't seen you in a few days. I'm just curious, have you had a chance to use your safety plan? How did it go? Anything that we want to change that's on there? Or, wow, you know, it's been a couple months since we made this, and I noticed there's been some changes in your social scene. Are there people on here that no longer need to be on here and other people that should be? This should be a living, breathing document because we are changing and evolving. We are hopefully trying things out and seeing what works, and then feeling comfortable making this a collaborative effort to then modify it. A note about parents, right? Maybe more than a note, maybe several notes about parents, because they're critical here. They're our partners. There are partners with this child. So we want the safety plan to be the child's voice. We don't want the parents kind of overriding that voice, but we want them to be part of a conversation where we review the safety plan. They may or may not be present when you're creating this. That really depends on the circumstances and the relationship, but we want to have a conversation where we're reviewing this with the child and the parent, where we're emphasizing this support, this connection. Again, coming back to everything Jim said about all the big feelings that a parent may be holding, insecurity, right? Self-flagellation, how did I not know this was happening? So this is where we're giving parents a really important role, an important connection right here to their child. Remembering we're all in this together because we're trying to keep this individual safe. So even at times when it feels like we can be a little bit at odds, right? Remembering that the goal of this document right here is to put us all on the same page. It's very rare, but we'll mention that, you know, if a parent is really refusing kind of to participate in the assessment, in the safety protocols, safe storage of lethal means, you may need to get authorities involved. It's very rare, but we did want to just include a note about that. I've said it a lot here, right? That the goal of this is to lift the student's voice. It can be such an incredibly disempowering time for them, having gone to the hospital, whatever happened at the hospital, coming back, the overwhelm, having a lot of people talking at them. And this is really a chance for us to say, we're listening. What do you need? What do you not need? What works for you? Help me help you, right? Really lifting their voice. This is especially true when it comes to involving their parents. We're going to need parental involvement, but helping the student talk about what that means for them is also really important because they're going to have different relationships with each parent. They're going to have different relationships student to student, right? Parent to parent. And they may be able to give you clues in what they're saying, right? Do they feel connected? Do they feel supported? Is there sibling rivalry? That sense of burdensomeness. And really giving them that chance to have the voice, that is so paramount. So we are actually starting to pull this all together. Jim, I'm going to invite you to jump in here on this slide. I think this is a good place for your voice.
I just wanted to sort of add two things about the safety plan. I think one is that Rebecca's talking about the reasons for living, and there's actually been some recent research that with adolescents particularly, that talking about reasons for living is a really great intervention. And I don't know how many of you sort of know about sort of the reasons for living questionnaire that was developed by Marsha Linehan. for adults. And I think there's like 72 questions on that one. But there is a brief version for adolescents. I think there's just 14 questions. And so if you just Google brief reasons for living for adolescents, I think you'll find that. But the research is really pretty hopeful about how helpful that is when you're talking with adolescents, supporting them. The other thing is too, with I know there's a lot of people on the call who are in elementary schools, and the research around safety plan is that it's effective with kids as young as 10 years old. But we've actually used it with even younger kids, even kids as young as 5 or 6 years old, having a variation of the safety plan. So definitely something to think about, and don't think you can't do a safety plan because you're supporting a third grader or a fourth grader. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but just sort of being a good listener. Suicidal people tell us over and over again, I just want somebody to listen. I want a chance to tell my story. So being a good listener, not immediately jumping into problem-solving mode, is gonna be something that people who are struggling are gonna find really helpful. And then we've talked a lot about, especially with parents, about practicing extreme empathy, right? So these parents who can just sort of feel resistant, and it feels like they're getting in their child's way sometimes and getting in the school's way of supporting their child, just going back and trying to figure out what's going on with these parents. How much struggles have they been having with the school over the years? How much just understanding that they might very well have had their own struggles in school when they were growing up. High likelihood that they themselves have a trauma history. So a lot of those behaviors that look resistant might actually be ways that they've found to take better care of themselves and keep themselves safer. And just offering practical help and identifying resources. I think you have good resources in your schools, but what about community resources? And again, I think especially thinking about kids and the whole issue of social connections and being part of a culture of learning, are there things that outside resources? And we're not necessarily just talking about mental health resources. I mean, are there activities that the student would love to get involved in? And how do we make that happen? It may take, we may need an adult, we may need a mentor to go with that child to that first meeting of the baseball team, or the first meeting of going to sort of join a club that's putting on plays or other kinds of activities. Again, I know I'm preaching to the choir, just avoiding judgment, trying to empower parents. And then it's just so important just not to assume that things are going well. We want to celebrate those small victories. So I think that these are sort of some of the final thoughts that we're thinking about at this point. And love if you have any feedback for us. I mean, anything new that you learned that was particularly helpful. I suspect that a lot of you have been doing a lot of these things, and we're just reinforcing principles that you're already engaging in. You are part of a large bureaucracy, and so sometimes change can be slow or take time. But what are some of the other obstacles that get in the way? Are there clinical obstacles that you can foresee that maybe you can get help overcoming some of those obstacles? And then always, I think a successful training instills confidence and increases people's skills, but mostly we want to make sure that a training helps you change your behaviors. What are things that you can do in your work now based on today's training that you can sustain those through through the next few years until we have additional research. So these are some of the things that we hope you'll sort of let us know about. I don't know if anybody can put anything in the chat now, or if you are watching this recording, that you will certainly feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you have. And it's been absolute delight to offer this training to you. I appreciate, Mike, your patience with us in getting things set up in terms of all the tech issues and things. And we definitely want to keep the dialogue open here. And thank you for listening today.
Thank you all so much. You're doing such amazing and important work. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, and thank everyone for attending. I don't know if there was any questions. I didn't see any little electronic hands going up or anything. I think everyone was just kind of following along and listening like I was. I know I certainly have some new things to kind of think about. So if there is nothing else, then I can stop the recording and release everyone to go. Oh,
somebody might be, let's see. Oh, no, I guess not. I thought somebody was starting a chat.
Okay. Okay. Well, then it looks like we are good to go. Thank you.
I also see someone starting a chat right now.
Oh, okay. Well, then I will pause this. It looks like I was getting a little quick.
I guess not.
No? Okay. Well, alrighty then. Well, thank you so much. Let me go ahead and stop the recording.